She received the 2017 Yeovil Fiction Award and has held fellowships at Yaddo McDowell, Hedgebrook, and other residencies. A longtime senior editor at Viking Penguin, she worked with authors such as Saul Bellow, Robert Fagles, Kim Edwards, Terry McMillan, and Paul Beatty. She taught book editing at New York University for nearly 20 years, earning a Teaching Excellence Award. Her debut novel, The English Problem, will be published in India in January 2026. Our second speaker is Mehek Jamal, who is a filmmaker and author from Kashmir. She is a 2022 South Asia Speaks Fellow, awarded to outstanding emerging writers from the region. Her film Bad Egg premiered at the 19th Indian Film Festival, Stuttgart, and won the Audience Award. It was screened at and won awards at multiple film festivals, including Melbourne, Madrid, Chicago, Atlanta, Washington, D.C., Kerala, Bangalore, and Dharamshala. She is a film alumna of Shrishti Institute of Art, Design and Technology, Bangalore. Loyal Kashmir, Love and Longing in a Torn Land 2025 is her first book. The moderator is Manisha Sobrajani, who works with communities in remote and hostile environments across India, focusing on trauma, reconciliation, and the human cost of conflict and displacement. With a background in journalism and publishing, she combines rigorous research and a deep commitment to lived realities in her fieldwork and writing, amplifying voices often excluded from mainstream narratives. Her work engages with grassroots groups, policymakers, and scholars, bridging gaps between on-the-ground realities and broader discourses of justice and human rights. The Land I Dream Of, The Story of Kashmir's Women 2014 was the first book, and Shadows of Azadi, Women's Lives in the Crucible of Kashmir 2025 is the latest edited volume of essays. Can I please request the speakers and the moderator to please take their seats on stage?
Thank you, Shweta, for introducing all of us. And thank you for being here this early on a Sunday morning. And thank you, Beena. Thank you, Mehek, for joining me in this conversation. Tell us about your respective books. I got the chance to read a few pages, and I'm eager to know from your perspective what your books are about. Mehek, would you like to start?
Hello? Yeah. Hi. Good morning, and thank you for being here. Very excited to speak about our books today. So my book is called Lol Kashmir, Love and Longing in a Torn Land. Lol is the Kashmiri word for love, longing, affection. It is kind of a multifaceted word. The book is, in a nutshell, it's a chronological telling of the Kashmir conflict over the last 30 to 40 years, but through the lens of love. There are 16 real-life stories of love in the book, and they start around the 80s and the 90s, around the militancy, and end around the early 2020s with the abrogation of Article 370. So the book chronicles all of that. So yeah, there's a basic introduction, and we'll, of course, speak about it more.
Beena, tell us about your book.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes. So The English Problem takes its lead from a statement made by Lord Macaulay in 1835, when he said that the people of this land, meaning India, are so intelligent, they're so proud, they're not thieves, they're so honest. We'll never conquer them because they're too proud. And the only way we'll be able to do this is by convincing them that their culture, their civilization, isn't really worth very much. One shelf of European literature, English literature, equals 5,000 years of their civilization. He didn't exactly put it that way, but that's the equivalence there. And he said that we should create a superclass in India which will be as English as the English, so that we can convince them, that class can convince the other Indians that you must aim to be like us. Your goal should be to become as English as the English. And I found this fascinating because the legacy of that is with us today. It's very much a kind of chip on one's shoulder for all the wonders that India has achieved and for everything that it's doing. We're still in thrall, a little bit in thrall. And I wanted to examine that. I've done it through the life of one man, Shiv Advani, who is sent to England to become a barrister. And this is the Englishifying, if you like, anglicizing, but I would say Englishifying of this young man so that he can come back and lead from the front lines of India. So this is about his encounters with people and with the nation of the land of his oppressors, and the English themselves.
Thank you. This brings me to a question that's been on my mind since I started reading your book. The protagonist, Shiv, this is how, so yours is a novel and yours is a collection of real life
Non-fiction,
stories. Non-fiction, yeah. So Shiv, the novel begins by Shiv finding himself in the living room of an English couple who are celebrating their 25th anniversary. And he's come there for a purpose, and the English people in their heads are thinking that they want him to become like them eventually. That's the sense I got. And Mehak, when I read the first story in your book, Javed finds himself surrounded by army jawans who want him to read his love letter to them. And he's reading them and he's explaining to them because it's written in Urdu. So, in a way, both of you have tried to capture how it feels to be the other in a room or in a group of people who treat you as the subject, and at the same time you are part of that conversation while being the other. So tell us a little about that. Bina, tell us about Shiv.
So the book begins with him arriving. Actually, it begins with in Hyderabad, Sindh, which again is a perspective that has not been covered in fiction. Sindh was very much involved with the independence movement, and I was so intrigued by that. You have Punjab, Sindh, the Gujarat, or Maratha in the national anthem, and yet its part in the struggle for Indian independence hasn't yet been covered, really. And I think I've just scraped the tip of the iceberg. But anyway, it's there. It's the tensions, I think, between belonging. Shiv has just left his home in Hyderabad, Sindh. It's been a 17-day journey, and he's arrived in London, freezing, bitterly cold, with a bright orange, not a color, not a very English color. They go for greys and the beige palette. He arrives there with this bright orange scarf around his neck, feeling like a python is strangling him because it's so much at odds with the color palette that he's seeing. And so I think that interested me, the tensions in that scene of feeling so foreign, so alien, and yet, what is his brief? His brief is to become like them. And so in that room, he's standing there thinking, really? This is what I should become? And he vows, no, absolutely not. I will never become an Englishman. And so it starts from there, and there's a much later scene where he has a child, a completely white child, because he was married to an English woman. And they are in Piccadilly watching the Christmas lights, fade and come alive in shop windows. And he stands by the statue of Eros at Piccadilly thinking, I can't go on. I really just can't go on. And he sinks down and sits on one of the steps, clutching his child. And a policeman comes up to him and says, Mr. Get Up, whose child is that, you know? And the whole ordeal of going home, finding the birth papers of the child, feeling so alien and so other because he's dark and his child is white. Again, that conflict between, and the question, who are you? You know, you're the father of this child, and yet to society around you, you're not the father of this child. You have to prove it. So those moments of tension really interest me, and the novel is full of them for that reason, you know.
So the story, Love Letter, I'll just give a little context for it. So Javed is like a 16, 17-year-old in the early 90s in Kashmir, in Anantnag. So he's dating a girl and he's gotten this love letter from her written in Urdu, and he wants to go show it off to his friend in the next village. But before he can, a crackdown starts. So for context, a crackdown in Kashmir is basically when the army comes to a place and asks all the men of the houses to come out with their identification cards. So it can be a very long process. And they first just, their IDs are checked, and then they are sent over for the next round, where there's a line of jeeps standing in a row with their, their glasses blacked out and everything, so you can't really see who's inside. But in one of them is sitting a mukbir. A mukbir is an informant for the army. And one by one, the men are paraded in front of the jeeps. It's called the identification parade. And if any of the men is known by the mukbir to have affiliations with the Tehreek or the militancy, he presses the horn, and the person his face is covered and he's taken away for interrogation. So this crackdown breaks out in Javed's village, and he's with the rest of the men, he's waiting for his turn. And while he's being searched by the army, they find his letter. And they look at it and it's in Urdu, so they think it's really suspicious. So they're like, what is this? And he doesn't know what else to say, but just say, it's a love letter. And they look at him kind of weirdly, and they set him aside, and they send all the men to the next round. And he's like really, he's shitting bricks because he thinks that, okay, this is how I go. But to his surprise, they all take off their helmets and they sit down on the ground and they say, Ab suna, apni love letter. So they tell him to recite the love letter to them. Now, at this point, to understand the power dynamics of this, he is somebody who's grown up knowing and being told that, to be wary of the army, to be scared of them, because he knows people around him who have been picked up and haven't come back. So he knows he has to do this. But at the same time, he can also see that these men are very young. They're like 20, 21, and they're genuinely interested in his love story. So for him, it is sort of like a humiliation ritual, but for them, they're also like, we want to have some fun. So he slowly just starts narrating his love letter to them, beat by beat, line by line. And because it's in Urdu, he says it with a flourish, he recites it, he gives them the entire translation of what it is about, and they're lapping it up, and they're eating out of the palm of his hand. And essentially, slowly the day slowly comes to an end. He realizes that there's this invisible camaraderie between him and these soldiers. But at the same time, he doesn't want anybody to see this because he is wary about what they'll think about his affiliations or what this means. So at the end of it, when the letter is done, everything is, the crackdown is also coming to a close. He sees the soldiers wearing the helmets back again and kind of transforming again into these formidable people who he's afraid of, and he's again that normal, like just a regular boy in that village. So for that moment which they shared with each other is over, and probably neither of them are going to tell, their friends or family or for the soldiers, their other comrades about this moment that they had. So as you said in your question, it's really about being in a situation where, the contradictions of the land around you come to the fore, because you may see somebody as the other or the oppressor, for example. But there are human links also in between, which can be, the human connections which can be seen from time to time. But at the end of the day, it doesn't negate anything else, and in the bigger picture, nothing else changes. And at the end of the story, he just says that nothing really changed for him, but he just started carrying a love letter in his pocket from that day onwards. Yeah.
I was instantly hooked to the essay when I read about it, and I had goosebumps wondering what might happen to him, but thankfully it doesn't end on a bad note for Javed. And finding Shiv, where I did find him in your novel, I was curious how the rest of his journey would go. And I also thought about Joan Didion's essay, Why I Write, in which she says that writing is a journey of self-exploration. You discover yourself rather than attending to some abstract idea or writing about political events. So how was it writing for you, Veena? Why did you write this book? I mean, you've been a senior editor, you've written long-form, short-form articles for magazines and journals, but why a book?
Well, this book has always haunted me. I mean, I finally sat down to write it. But it comes from, everything begins with a story. And for me, it was my father. We live in America, and he would look back nostalgically at this time when there was this much older brother whom he never knew, who went on to England, was handpicked by Gandhi, and Gandhi actually influenced my grandfather to send him to the UK, to the Inns of Court, and to qualify as a barrister, and hopefully come back and be one of the young leaders of a new independent India. He does. He goes to England, he stays with the Polaks, dear friends of Gandhi's. They are real people. They're in the book. I've imagined what they might be like because there isn't much out there on the Polaks. But my father said, do not forget the name, H.S.L. Polak, and I never did. Henry Solomon Leon Polak, and they were my uncle's guardians in London. So this about, he died young, he suffered an accident in London, he became very successful, he started a journal called the India Bulletin, and people like Bertrand Russell, Sylvia Pankhurst, Muriel Lester, all of them were on the masthead. There are letters between H.G. Wells and people like that, and the Woolfs, actually Mr. Polak, and Leonard Woolf of the Hogarth Press delivered parliamentary papers to, in Parliament on the state of India. So I felt sure that if he was living with the Polaks, he would know the Woolfs, and that's how the Woolfs are in the book. So what inspired this story is, why did the family not revere this young man? Why didn't they talk about him with awe and with respect? He did something extraordinary. He went to England at a time when they were still the oppressors. He went to the land of the oppressors to educate himself, but also to educate the British on what was actually happening in India. The Rollout Act had just been passed. 4 Indians gathering at a street corner could be jailed just for gathering there. So it was interesting to me how he must have felt being in England at the time. And of course, I was educated in England too, many, many decades later, but my experience sort of fused with his. The book was asking to be written. And the very funny thing about writing is that after 4 years of solid research, which is what it took, there was nothing out there on the Polaks, on the connection between the Woolf's Hogarth Press and India. Well, there was a little bit on that, but not a lot. And so the creative spirit in me, how does that conjoin with fact? How does it transform what has actually happened into a story. And that is what happened. It emerged. The first 1/3 of the book was me trying very hard. Who are these people? What are they like? You know, what is London like? What does a young man want? How does he feel about his parents back home? How does he feel about every day taking him a little bit away from his original mission? And I was just completely fascinated by the story and wanted to tell it. So that was
I'll come back to that later.
Yeah.
Meg, tell us why you wrote a book. You're a filmmaker, and your film Bad Eggs will be screened here later today, and it's received a lot of acclaim. So why a book?
So I was born in Srinagar and born and brought up, did all my schooling there. Where I was born in the 90s. So I think I really came of age in the early 2000s. And you know, that's when you kind of understand, get a lay of the land and slowly start picking up cues and seeing that, okay, this is, you know, that you're living in a place of conflict. If you always been there, you don't see it. But for me, so I'm half Maharashtrian, my mother's Maharashtrian, so we used to go to Bombay for our winter vacations each year. And I would see the dichotomy of my life and see, okay, whatever I think is normal is actually not so normal for other people because, because of the very high militarization in Kashmir. Even in 1999, I remember during the Kargil war, I would wait for my bus, at the bus stop, and we would just see a convoy of army trucks going to Ladakh. And for minutes, like 10 to 15 minutes, it would just continue, and our bus stop would be stranded for that time, and we would all reach school late. So these are tiny markers which I slowly started picking up these things for myself. And so when you realize that you're from a place of conflict, I think you internalize a lot of it. But I think it really came to the fore for my generation after 2008, when the summers of civil unrest started in Kashmir in 2008, 9, 10. So every summer, like clockwork, there would be something which happened in Kashmir, and there would be protests, there would be lockdown calendars, there would be curfew hartals, and a lot of people would die on the streets. And that's when I slowly started understanding that there's always that dichotomy when you're from a place like Kashmir where you want to live a normal life, but you also understand what is happening around you. So as a teenager, that was very jarring for me, but I also understood that nobody knows what's happening within us. Like nobody documents the lived experiences of a conflict, the human experiences of it. And I think finally that culmination happened for me in 2019 with the abrogation of Article 370 and 35A, because Kashmir, Jammu Kashmir, Ladakh, all of it, the whole region was put under this very long communication blockade which lasted months. Phone lines, landlines started first, and then phones started after 3-4 months. Internet wasn't back for like 5-6 months, and even then it was 2G speeds. And immediately after that lockdown, the whole world went into the COVID lockdown. So Kashmiris just went from one lockdown to another. The second one, only they had some form of communication. So during that time, basically, there was a big clampdown of voices from the ground. There was no news coming out of Kashmir. It was really hard to connect with people there. I was working in Bombay at that time, so it took me a long time to get in touch with my father, who was there. Finally, we were scouring numbers on Facebook groups, trying to find some number which we can connect to, because a lot of officials and police people had satellite phones which were working. So we finally found an SHO's number near our house. We called him, said, okay, can you please go here and give this phone to this person? And he did that, and that's how I spoke to my father after a few weeks after the abrogation happened. So at that time, that got me started, I started thinking about what happens to something like love when something like this happens, when you're away from your beloved or your loved one. And I started hearing small, small stories of the kind of things that people did at that time to reach out to one another. Because it wasn't just a communication blockade, it was also physical blockades, because there were, checkpoints and concertina wiring everywhere in the city for a long time, so you couldn't easily move about either. Journalists weren't able to file their stories. They all had one media center, which was in this makeshift center in a hotel, and they had, dismal internet speeds, like in kbps. So how do you file your stories like that, right? So it felt like, there's a very, like a concerted effort to make sure that nothing comes out. So when I started, hearing these stories of lovers getting in touch with each other, I thought, okay, there's something in here. There's something in here to document. And I put out a call for this for Lowell Kashmir 5 years ago in ending 2020. So 2019 was very fresh in people's minds. And I just said, I want to collect stories of love and longing during a period of conflict. And people just poured out, and they reached out to me, and it was very overwhelming, like an overwhelming amount of people. And then slowly I realized it was not just around the abrogation, it was before, it was over time. So I started collecting more and more stories over the last 30, 40 years. And why it became a book was, I think, just because I wanted to do justice to as many of them as possible, which I felt wouldn't be possible with a film or even a group of films or an anthology. So that's why I pivoted to and wrote a book, because even if it's, eventually if it becomes a film at least or not, it's still a book and it's here. So, yeah.
And would you say that while documenting these stories, were you somehow detached from the circumstances, or were you very much part of the circumstances? Because like you said, you've grown up watching things that for people outside of Kashmir are normal or not. So what
No,
was...
I don't think I was detached. I feel like, see, I was speaking to strangers. I think most of the people in the book I haven't spoken to before. There are a few people who I knew from before, but I was very surprised by why they were speaking to me, and why were they, why they were telling me about their love lives or intimate details of their lives. So that's when I realized that there's a gap over there, because in a lot of these conversations, I kept hearing one thing over and over again, which was that, oh, nobody asks us about this part of our lives. And, we live and we love. And yes, there are other facets to our lives as well, but also this. It's not this or that. It's this and that. And so I think that was very fascinating for me to see in my conversations. And I think any conversation begins with a form of enrolling somebody into it.
Yes.
So I would always start a conversation with telling them about me and who I am and why I'm doing this. And when people hear the why, I think that is the first thing of them trusting you. And because most of these people reached out to me and my call, I think their first step of deciding to tell a story had already happened for them. I think it's when you go out and you try to look for people that convincing needs a little bit of work. But here, I think they'd made that decision for themselves before speaking to me.
Bina, coming back to you, what you said previously. So it's not just self-exploration, it's also discovering the journey of your family members. Tell us about that.
So I think, there were two elements controlling this story. One is the idea of departure, and the other is the twin pole of homecoming. And I wanted to look at both. Departure has its own, but fairly predictable cycle. There is, there is homesickness, there's a fear of the unknown, all of that. It's full of expectation and hope as well. You can sort of almost predict what a departure is going to be like. It's the homecoming that's the complicated one. And I think between these two poles, The structure of the book reflects that. What I learned is that when my uncle suffered this accident, my grandfather paid for him to come back by ship, accompanied by a British doctor and a nurse. And to me, that was fascinating. You know, what was that journey like? My novel takes place 10 years after the real Shiv, Atma, came back to India. And I think set between two land masses, Europe, England, and India, in a ship, suffering a sort of mental crisis where memory suddenly charges in, and it's such a shapeshifter, the way memory brings things to life again. And he's reliving his life in England in the hull of that ship. Not the hull exactly, but in a cabin in that ship with a nurse beside him. Remembering what England was like, remembering what India had been like, remembering how he left, and conscious, increasingly conscious as his brain picks up of what he's going to. I think that was fascinating to me, just how does the past come alive? And what is the future that you're going to? And I think being between two, as I say, land masses, as it were, was critical to the structure of this book. I forgot to say one thing earlier. When I started, you know, as I say, the first 1/3 was very hard. And then somehow the characters took over. They were full characters. They were living, breathing entities on the page. And they basically told me to get out of the picture. It's like, we've got this. We're carrying this story forward. Can you please get out of the way? And they did. They had their own momentum. They had their own destinies to fulfill. Here I was trying to control things, and I was no longer the director. I was a member of the audience, like you, not the director. And watching that happen was to me so fascinating. I was like, great, run with it, it's yours, you know. And so it becomes a process of discovery for you too, because you are now a part of the audience, watching it happen. Can you imagine what that feels like? The first 1/3 was so hard. It's like, who are you all? Where have you come from, you know? And why have you picked me to tell your story? And then it was like, great, we found our vessel. You were the right vessel, now you can leave, you know. And to me, that moment was both exciting and frightening at the same time. Why did I turn to writing this novel? As I said, it had to be written. There was no way this novel could have gone unwritten, you know. I know that's a funny thing to say, but there is no way it could have gone unwritten. So I wrote it.
That's lovely. So your novel deals with the British colonizing India. That's the larger plot of it. And Meg, your work looks at Kashmir's undecided political state. So I want to understand from you both through your writing, when communities as large as Kashmiris and Indians go through a major political mass event like colonization and the conflict in Kashmir, how do communities deal with it? Do they deal with it? Is it possible to deal with such huge events which have such repercussions?
Well, there is a dislocation, there's no question. I mean, the theme of this was meant to be dispossession and belonging. And to go back to that, I think there is a severe dislocation because psychically and psychologically you no longer know who you are. And I think when a standard has been set for you, that is, become as British as you can possibly be, the effort to do that means neglecting everything that your own heritage and your own culture has taught you. And what does that do to you? You know, how is it that you suddenly stop eating with your fingers and you're eating with a fork? And how is it that you know, you're watching very carefully, suddenly your kurta pajama is no longer acceptable. Suddenly it's, you know, trousers and a shirt and a tie. How do these transformations happen and what do they do to you? So the first half of first, I would say 20 pages of my novel is Shiv being taken by Mr. Polak to Jermyn Street, a very fancy shopping street near Piccadilly in St. James's. And he's taken from one bespoke tailor to another, one fancy shop to another. He picks up shirts, he picks up scents, he picks up an ivory topped cane, an umbrella, shoes from Lob, cashmere socks. All of this is purchased for him, and he's watching the money slip away as he becomes an Englishman. And this is actually really quite funny, the beginnings. The one moment that Shiv can call his own in those early scenes is when Mr. Polak says, no, you cannot wear a scent that makes you smell like the exotic Orient. You have to wear a stable English scent. And he says, no, I'm going to go for that one, because that reminded him of oranges from Quetta and sandalwood from Mysore. And no, these were the scents that he knew. These were the scents that he wanted back in his life. No, he told Mr. Polak, I'm not buying your English fern, I'm going with this one, you know. And it was a moment of triumph for him. So that assertion of your identity and how it comes through demands to be seen when you're being decultured in that way, you know, was very interesting to me. So that
Yeah.
dislocation,
Yeah.
psychic and psychological, yeah.
Mehak?
So, if you look at the word dispossession in the context of Kashmir and the land and its people, I think you know, Kashmir has been ruled by foreign rulers for many centuries. And so there have been waves of different kinds of conflict over time. But, you know, just to be, I think for me, I'll just talk about the current conflict. And if you can really trace the roots of that, I think if you go back, we could go back to basically the accession of the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir to India, right? Which happened under a provisional accession of a promised plebiscite, which never happened. And you could say that a lot of the troubles which have come Kashmir's way have been because of the butterfly effect of that till now. What happens to a group of people who go through cyclic violence and conflict over the years is interesting, because it becomes a way of life. So there is a very big desensitization to it. And secondly, you feel it. You know, there's so much undiagnosed PTSD in the Kashmir Valley, which nobody talks about. So I think that dichotomy is always there. And over and above everything, there's a dispossession of memory, I think. Because for a long time, I think Kashmir was written about by people not from there, in the English language especially. I think it's been only slowly started in the 90s, and only over the last at least 15, 20 years that more Kashmiris have started writing about the place and the people, and there's been a concerted effort of documenting, and not just documenting through an academic or journalistic lens, because that was happening. I think people have started realizing that their lives of what has happened to them is very important. So you see so much fiction, so many memoirs coming from Kashmir, so much non-fiction, narrative non-fiction. My book is a book, you know, it's narrative non-fiction. And I think it's a collective effort to preserve public memory, because a lot of it, first of all, can blur into each other. Secondly, there is so much censorship in Kashmir. If you go back to the newspaper archives from the early 2000s, 2010s, you can't find them online anymore. You know, you'll get an error message for most of the major newspapers. Even right now, if you've been, looking at the news, there are Kashmiri journalists, even with the national dailies, who have been summoned by the police and being interrogated for hours over many, many days, so that they stop writing about what's happening on ground. So, and I felt this more and more after the abrogation in 2019. There's an eerie silence almost. And in Kashmir, there's a cloud of normalcy being shown. And whoever, especially journalists, whoever writes against it is in jail. And there's so many journalists who are still in jail. So when that becomes reality, I think it becomes the responsibility of regular people, like me, for example, or other writers who have gone through the conflict themselves, to write about their most personal accounts. Because when one person, a journalist, says this happened, it's news and it's fact, sure, it is, and you can go by that, but if it's erased, what happens? You don't have anything. But when many people say this happened to me, this happened to me, this happened to me, you create a collective undeniability of something, and you make that more solid in history and in memory. So I feel right now we're in a place where memory is becoming even more important to preserve before it falls through the cracks in Kashmir. And I think the efforts are being made, but there's a lot to be done. Yeah.
I feel that I could ask you questions for the next several hours, but unfortunately we're running out of time. So I'd like to invite the audience, if you have any questions for the authors. Would anyone like to ask them? I'm happy to ask you more. Yes, please.
Mahek, this is a question for you. They say that during conflict, literature is what tells us what people of the region are going through, not journalists, not media. It's amazing that people like you and others are putting together these stories. How do you deal, you spoke about journalists being investigated. How do writers like you, and even fiction writers, poets like you, cope with the sense of fear that, how far can I say what I want to say? Look, even that story that you mentioned, Javed and the Jawans, that can be, certain people may want to interpret it in a certain way. And how do writers like you and others cope with this? So we on the outside have no clue at all.
Yeah, I think once your book, for example, in this context, it's my book. Once it's out into the world, you really can't do anything about how people receive it, right? So when I was writing it, I was actually, every non-fiction book goes through a legal read at some point. And I was very surprised that my publishers didn't ask me to cut much. It was only a few things, and even that they said, just cite this and it'll be fine. There were only a few things which I can't. The thing is, I can't even tell you right now because I'm afraid if I tell you, they told me this thing, I'll get into trouble. So I feel when I'm writing, I censor myself lesser than when I'm talking. Because, I feel that's the world we're in, that, reaches more, in writing has given me more freedom. And I'm a filmmaker, and I see the difference. Like, films are much harder to make because there's so much polarization over there today that it's basically impossible to make anything which has a political bone in it. But during writing, I didn't feel that. So I feel like that's still a safe space, but not that safe also. But I think there's something over there. There's also an interesting thing which I realized from beginning my project to when my book came out, because they're all real people and real stories. At some point, my publishers asked me to go back and get permissions from them, written permissions. I didn't know I had to do that, get releases, right, in the beginning. And I thought, okay, they've given me their consent, and they've spoken to me, so of course they'll be on board. But I was very wrong, because some people, not a lot, they changed their minds after 4-5 years. And that kind of also showed me how the world around them had changed and what they were seeing around them for people speaking up or even doing the bare minimum. There was one journalist who himself said, I'm not sure anymore, but then he finally came around because he said, if I don't do it, who's going to do it? But that is the state of affairs. So I think people are self-censoring, but I'm very thankful that the people who are in the book decided to. Also, a lot of them decided to be anonymous. So that's a big thing in the book. I think it's only 3 or 4 chapters in which people have decided to retain their names and their identities. Otherwise, it's mostly pseudonyms, because that is also, it's an interesting dilemma, because they want to tell their stories and they're like, this needs to be out there, but they take one step back just to say, but people should know it's me. So, yeah.
Does that answer your question? Anybody else? Okay, I have a question. So, Mehak, you've divided your book into 3 parts: the day before yesterday, yesterday, and today. So why is there no future? And Beena, my question to you is that, does your novel follow a chronology? Would you say it's linear in nature, or is it, like you said, the characters took over and you were
Yeah.
out of it?
No, it's not linear. I mean, that was actually one of the issues in the beginning, and why each chapter has a place and a date accompanying it is to actually situate the reader, tell you where you are and where this action is happening. It's because it wasn't linear and it wasn't chronological in that way. But there is a circularity, because memory has its own momentum and its own movement, as it were, through your mind. And it isn't chronological. If you remember things, you remember them in a jagged way, That jagged path is what I wanted to follow in the novel. It's a fractured remembering, but it is a remembering nevertheless. And that is what the novel captures, really. It's not linear, no. No.
It's not linear.
No.
And Mehak, how about yours?
So yeah, the 3 sections are Otr. Otr means
Yes,
day before
day
yesterday, Raat is yesterday, Az is today. And they are divided chronologically. So day before yesterday is about the militancy in the 80s and the 90s, the Kashmiri Pandit exodus, all of that. Then Raat is a shorter section. It's around the 2000s, the late 2000s and the summers of unrest around that time. And the last section and the longest section is after the abrogation. Of course, they're broken up chronologically, but I think also in terms of context, because of course they bleed into each other in terms of time. So, but just the context of where they're set and what the people, because they're also told at different points of memory, right? The ones in the last section are told by people when it's very fresh in their memory, like 2-3 years before. So how those stories are structured and told, I think they're very fresh and raw. So I think if you read them together, you get that. But whereas where you begin, I think that's also in hindsight. So people have mulled over it, they have made their own peace with it. So I think, dividing it that way was, kind of gave a narrative and structural flow to the book. And I felt like I should just write one, tomorrow, like Paga, over there and leave a blank page, but I thought it's too gimmicky and I didn't do it.
All right. Thank you. Thank you both for this very engaging conversation. And I want you both to sign my copies of your respective books, please.
Of course. And thank you everybody for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you.